My name is Edward Callahan. I'm 71 years old. And before I tell you what happened on that Sunday morning, I need you to understand something. I have buried a wife. I have buried a brother. I have stood at gravesides and felt the kind of grief that hollows a man out from the inside. I thought I knew what the worst phone call of my life would sound like. I was wrong. The worst phone call of my life didn't come with grief in the voice on the other end. It came with a smile. I could hear it. You can hear a smile through a telephone line if you've lived long enough, if you've been lied to enough times, if you've learned the sound of a man enjoying himself at your expense. That's what I heard at 6:30 in the morning on a Sunday in my own kitchen, with the coffee pot still gurgling behind me. The name on the screen was Preston, my son-in-law, the man my daughter married 4 years ago, the man I shook hands with at his wedding and told with my whole chest, "Take care of her." I remember saying those words. I remember meaning them. I picked up the phone thinking something was wrong with the car, or the dog, or maybe he was calling to ask if he could borrow the ladder again. That's the kind of call I was expecting. A Sunday morning nothing call. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how I slept. He said, flat and cold, like he was reading a weather report, "Your daughter died last night." I want you to sit with that for 1 second the way I had to sit with it, except I only got about 1/10 of a second before the next sentence hit me because he didn't pause. He didn't give me room to fall apart. He just kept talking, and what came out of his mouth next is the reason I am telling you this story today. "She left everything to me. You get nothing." And then, and I will never forget this sound as long as I live, he laughed. A real laugh. The kind of laugh a man lets out when he's already spent the money in his head. The kind of laugh that comes from a place with no bottom to it. "You lost her," he said, "and you lost it all." My hands went numb. I want to be honest with you because that's the only way I know how to tell this. For about 3 seconds, I believed him. 3 seconds where the whole world tipped sideways and I thought my daughter, my only child, the girl I taught to ride a bike in a church parking lot, the girl who used to fall asleep on my chest during Sunday football games, was gone. 3 seconds where I felt something in my body break that I don't think will ever fully heal. Phone call or no phone call, truth or no truth. I have thought about those 3 seconds more times than I can count since that morning. I've tried to explain it to people who ask, and the closest I can come is this. It's the feeling of the floor disappearing from underneath a house you've lived in your whole life, all at once, with no warning and no time to brace yourself before the fall. Every plan I had for the rest of my life, the holidays, the grandchildren I hoped for someday, the quiet years I imagined spending watching my daughter's business grow into something even bigger than it already was, all of it collapsed into a single, silent scream trapped somewhere behind my ribs, because my throat wouldn't let a sound out even if I'd wanted one to. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. My mouth wouldn't work. So I did the only thing my hands knew how to do. I pressed the speaker button because the daughter he was telling me had died in the night. The daughter he claimed had left him everything and left me nothing. The daughter he was laughing about like she was a line item on a spreadsheet. She was sitting behind me, at my kitchen table, in the same flannel robe she wore as a teenager, the one I never had the heart to throw out, and neither did she. Sipping her coffee like it was any other Sunday morning, she had heard every word. I watched her set the mug down without a sound. I watched her face change from sleepy to still, not shocked, still, like something in her had been waiting for this exact moment for a long, long time. She reached her hand out toward me, and I gave her the phone without even thinking about it, the way you hand someone a tool when they ask for it, and your body just obeys before your mind catches up. She looked me dead in the eyes. And in a voice I had never heard her use before, calm, level, colder than his had been, she said, "I'm going to stop right there, because I want you to hear exactly what my daughter said, word for word, the way it happened, at the exact moment it happened in this story. Not now, not yet. You deserve to hear it in its place, after you understand everything that led up to that Sunday morning, everything Preston thought he had gotten away with, and everything he had absolutely no idea was coming for him. What I can tell you right now is this. By the time Sunday afternoon rolled around, that man had unraveled every single lie he had spent months constructing, brick by brick, and he did it in front of every person who mattered to him, his family, his lawyer, and the people he thought he'd already fooled for good. He thought my daughter was dead and buried and out of his way. What he didn't understand was that the woman he married had spent the better part of a year becoming someone he never bothered to actually know. Before I take you back to where this really started, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I'm not a young man anymore, and I don't have the patience for wasting words. If you're the kind of person who believes family should mean something, who believes greed eventually shows its own face in the mirror, whether it wants to or not, then stay with me. Like this video, if it's already got a hook in you. Subscribe if you want to hear how a 71-year-old man and his daughter took apart a con artist without raising their voices once. And tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, because I'd like to know how far this story has traveled. Now let me take you back, 10 months before that phone call. Before any of us knew what Preston really was, my daughter's name is Diane. She is 34 years old, and for most of her life she has been the steadiest person I know. Her mother passed when Diane was 26, cancer, the slow kind that gives you time to say goodbye and steals it from you at the same time, and after that, it was just the two of us for a long while. We got close in a way fathers and daughters don't always get the chance to. She'd come by on Sunday mornings before church, and we'd sit at that same kitchen table and talk about nothing important. The weather, her job, whatever book I was pretending to read, Diane built something for herself. She started a small landscaping and design business out of the back of a pickup truck when she was 28, and by the time she turned 33, that business had grown into something real. Commercial contracts, a dozen employees, a name people around town actually recognized. She did that, not me, not anyone else. Her own hands, her own sleepless nights, her own risk. She met Preston at an industry mixer, one of those Chamber of Commerce dinners where everybody's shaking hands and nobody remembers half the names by morning. He worked in finance, some kind of investment consulting. The details always seemed to shift depending on who he was talking to, and he had a way about him, polished, quick with a compliment. He remembered everyone's birthday. He remembered everyone's kids' names. He shook my hand at that first dinner party like he'd known me for 20 years, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mr. Callahan, your daughter is the smartest woman I've ever met, and I don't say that lightly." I liked him. God help me, I liked him. I remember driving home after that first mixer dinner, and Diane called me the next morning practically bursting with excitement, telling me about this man who'd asked her real questions about her business. Not the polite, glazed-over kind of questions people ask to fill silence, but questions about her margins, her crew, her 5-year plan. She said it felt like the first time in a long while that a man had been interested in her mind before anything else. I remember feeling relieved for her. Diane had been through a couple of relationships in her 20s that left her guarded, careful, slow to trust. Hearing that kind of joy in her voice again made an old man's heart feel lighter than it had in years. Preston courted her the way you'd court someone if you'd read a manual on it. Flowers on the exact right occasions, never too often, never so rarely it felt neglectful. He learned her coffee order and never had to ask twice. He showed up to her company's first big commercial job with sandwiches for her whole crew, unannounced, just because he'd heard her mention it was going to be a long day. Small things, thoughtful things. The kind of things that build a reputation as a good one in a town where everybody talks. For the first 2 years, I had no reason not to. He showed up to Sunday dinners. He fixed my fence one weekend without being asked. He drove Diane to her business meetings when her truck was in the shop and made jokes about being her unpaid chauffeur. He called me Pop sometimes, which annoyed me at first and then, somewhere along the way, started to feel normal. He and Diane got married on a Saturday in October under a tent in my backyard because Diane wanted it simple, and I stood up at that reception with a glass of champagne in my hand and told the whole room, "Take care of her." I told him that directly. I shook his hand and I said it like a man saying something sacred. Everyone trusted Preston. That's the part I need you to understand, because it matters for everything that comes after. It wasn't just me. Diane's friends trusted him. My neighbors trusted him. The men at the barbershop where I get my hair cut once a month knew him by name and asked how that smart son-in-law of yours was doing. He built that trust carefully over years, the way a man builds a fence around a piece of land he intends to claim. I didn't know yet that the fence wasn't for keeping people out. It was for keeping Diane in. The thing that changed everything happened almost a year before that phone call. Diane's business had grown to the point where a regional landscaping conglomerate made her an offer, a real offer, the kind of number that makes your stomach drop the first time you hear it read out loud. They wanted to buy her out, keep her on as a regional manager if she wanted it, or let her walk away entirely with more money than either of us had ever seen sitting in one account. She sold it. After weeks of back and forth with lawyers, she signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and by Wednesday morning, my daughter had more money to her name than I'd earned across my entire working life combined. I remember she called me that night, giddy, half laughing, half in disbelief. "Dad," she said, "I don't even know what to do with myself." I told her to do something smart with it, invest it slowly, don't let anybody rush her into anything. I didn't know that somebody already had his hand halfway into that account before the ink was even dry. Preston's whole demeanor shifted after that sale, though it happened so gradually that neither Diane nor I noticed it happening in real time. That's the thing about a slow poison, you don't taste it until you're already sick. He started talking about wealth management and long-term structuring. He started using words like estate planning and asset protection, phrases that sound responsible, phrases that sound like love, when really they were the opening moves of something much colder. He suggested she consolidate her accounts for simplicity. He suggested they update their wills together, just to be safe, now that there's real money involved. He suggested a family friend of his, a man Diane had met exactly twice, handle her new investment portfolio. He suggested, gently, over and over, that it would be easier if he just handled the boring paperwork side of things so she could focus on what she loved. Every one of those suggestions sounded reasonable on its own. That's what made it so effective. A single lie is easy to spot. 100 small, reasonable-sounding suggestions stacked one on top of the other over the course of months. That's how a man builds a cage around a woman he claims to love and calls it protecting her. I started noticing things I couldn't quite name at first. Small things. Diane used to call me every few days just to talk, just because that's who she was. Those calls got shorter, then less frequent. Then they started going through Preston first. He'd answer her phone, tell me she was in a meeting or resting or swamped, and promise to have her call me back. Sometimes she did. Sometimes 2-3 days would pass before I heard her voice. When we did talk, something felt off in the way she spoke. Diane had always been direct, blunt, even a trait she got from her mother, God rest her. But over those months, her sentences started sounding careful, rehearsed, like she was reading from a script somebody else had handed her right before she picked up the phone. She'd say things like, "Preston thinks it's best if," far more often than she used to. My daughter used to finish her own sentences. Now she was finishing his. I mentioned it to a few of her old friends at a birthday gathering, casually, the way you test the water before wadding in. 2 of them admitted they'd noticed the same thing. One said Diane had cancelled on their monthly lunch 4 times in a row, always at the last minute, always with an apology that sounded like it had been written for her rather than by her. There was a Thanksgiving that year I still think about. Diane always had hosted every Thanksgiving since her mother passed, because she said it kept the tradition alive in a house that needed it. That year, Preston suggested, gently, that maybe it would be less stressful to host at his parents' place instead, since his mother had already offered, and it would take the burden off Diane during such a busy season for her business. Diane agreed. It seemed reasonable. It always seemed reasonable. But I remember sitting in his parents' dining room that November, watching Diane at the far end of the table, quieter than I'd ever seen her at a holiday gathering, and thinking that something about the whole arrangement didn't sit right with me, even though I couldn't have told you exactly what. Small decisions like that kept happening. Which car they'd take to visit me, his, because hers was less reliable, even though I'd watched her drive that truck for 6 years without a single problem. Which financial advisor they'd use, his contact, because it's good to keep things in the family circle. Which nights she was available for our old standing dinner, fewer and fewer, always with a reason that sounded legitimate on its own, but added up, over time, to a woman I saw less and less of. Bank appointments started happening that Diane never mentioned to me beforehand, only after the fact, in passing, if at all. Documents that used to sit in a folder on her kitchen counter, insurance policies, business paperwork, tax records, started disappearing into a locked filing cabinet in the home office Preston kept for himself. When I asked her about it once, just making conversation, she laughed it off. "Preston's just organized," she said. "You know how he is." I remember one evening in particular, a few weeks before Diane found that folder on his laptop, when I stopped by unannounced with a toolbox to help fix a leaky faucet she'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier. Preston answered the door instead of Diane. He was pleasant, as always, invited me in, offered me coffee, but there was a beat, just a flicker, before he called out to let Diane know I was there, like he was deciding something in that half-second pause. When Diane came around the corner, she looked surprised to see me, not happily surprised the way she used to be, but startled, like she'd been caught in the middle of something. I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it constantly now. I did know how he was. I just didn't know what that organization was actually for. Every father has a voice in the back of his head. Mine had been quiet for years, content, trusting. But somewhere around month 6 after that business sale, that voice started speaking up. Not shouting, just a low, steady hum underneath everything, the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and the furniture's been moved a few inches and you can't say exactly what's wrong, only that something is. Then came the night that changed everything, though I didn't learn about it until much later, because Diane didn't tell me right away. She told me everything eventually, every detail, sitting at that same kitchen table where this whole story started. But in the moment it happened, she went through it alone, and I still carry a piece of guilt about that, even now, even knowing there was nothing I could have done differently with the information I had. Diane found a folder. Not the locked filing cabinet, a folder Preston had left open on his laptop by accident one evening while he was in the shower. Insurance paperwork with her signature on it, except she had never signed it. A life insurance policy, taken out 8 months earlier, naming Preston as sole beneficiary, for an amount that made her stomach turn when she read the number twice to make sure she wasn't misreading it. She kept looking. She found a second document, a request to transfer the deed on the home her mother had left her, the home Diane had inherited outright, free and clear. The one piece of property that had nothing to do with Preston at all. The transfer request bore her signature too, a signature she had never put on paper. She found loan applications she'd never filled out, co-signed under her name, tied to accounts she didn't recognize. She found messages deleted, but not deleted well enough, because Preston was careful about most things except the one thing that mattered most, which was underestimating the woman he married. Those messages were between Preston and the family friend he'd pushed as her investment advisor. And in those messages, they weren't talking like a client and a consultant. They were talking like two men planning a heist, joking about timelines, joking about how trusting she was, joking about what would happen once everything was in place. Diane told me later that she sat on the bathroom floor of her own home for over an hour that night, phone in her lap, unable to move. Not crying, she said. Just still, the same kind of still I would see on her face months later, sitting behind me at my kitchen table. She didn't confront him. And I want to explain why, because I know some of you watching this might wonder why she didn't just walk into that house and demand answers right then and there. Because a woman who confronts a man like that before she has proof doesn't get justice. She gets a very good liar with time to cover his tracks, a wounded expression, and a story about how she's overreacting or paranoid or under a lot of stress since the sale. Diane knew that instinctively. She had watched him talk his way around smaller inconsistencies for months. She knew that if she showed her hand too early, he would simply build a new hand to beat it. So instead, my daughter did something that still, to this day, fills me with a kind of fierce pride I don't have adequate words for. She decided to disappear into plain sight. She started coming to my house more often, telling Preston she was helping her agging father, a line she used with a straight face, and one I forgave her for instantly once I understood the reason behind it. She started keeping a second, private phone. She started backing up every document she could get her hands on to a drive that never left her body. She started, quietly, meticulously, gathering evidence, while letting Preston believe that everything in their life together was exactly as it had always been. I found out 3 weeks into all of this. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening with a duffel bag and a face I hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table, and she told me everything. The insurance policy, the forged deed transfer, the messages, all of it, laid out in a voice that shook only slightly because my daughter has always been stronger than she gives herself credit for. I want to tell you what that did to me, sitting there listening to my only child describe how the man I shook hands with, the man I told to take care of her, had spent close to a year quietly building the machinery to steal everything she owned, and based on the size of that insurance policy, possibly planning for a future where she wasn't around to stop him. I felt something in my chest, that I can only describe as rage with nowhere to go. The kind of anger that doesn't shout. The kind that goes still and cold and starts calculating instead. I'm not a violent man, I never have been. But I sat at that table and I understood, for the first time in my life, exactly how a person could be pushed toward violence, and I understood why I couldn't let myself go there, because Diane needed a father with a clear head, not a father who'd throw away everything trying to satisfy his own fury. We're not going to confront him, Diane said, before I even had the chance to suggest it. We're going to be smarter than that. I asked her what she meant, she told me her plan, and it was, without question, the boldest thing I had ever heard my daughter say. Over the following months, Diane and I built a case the way you'd build a house, foundation first, and nothing rushed. We hired a lawyer, a sharp, quiet woman named Renata, who specialized in financial fraud and elder and spousal exploitation cases, someone Diane found through a contact 3 towns over, someone with no connection whatsoever to Preston's circle. We hired a private forensic accountant who went through every document Diane had copied with a fine-toothed comb. I sat in on most of those early meetings with Renata, mostly just to hold Diane's hand under the table, because I could see how much it cost her to lay out, piece by piece, in front of a stranger, exactly how badly she'd been deceived by a man she still, in some small buried corner of herself, had loved. Renata was patient with her. She'd stop the conversation whenever Diane needed a minute, hand her a tissue, remind her that none of this was her fault, that manipulation like this works precisely because it's built by someone who studies you closely enough to know exactly which doors to walk through slowly. I watched my daughter, week after week, turn her grief into something sharper, something useful. By the 3rd meeting, she wasn't crying anymore. She was taking notes. What they found made my blood run cold all over again. Every single time, a new piece came to light. The forensic accountant confirmed the deed transfer request had indeed been submitted with a forged signature, matched against exemplars from Diane's actual handwriting, and traced back to a notary office where Preston had a personal relationship with the notary. A college friend who, it turned out, had been notarizing documents without the actual signer present for a small fee for more than one client, as we would later learn. They found that the family friend, investment advisor, wasn't licensed at all. He had let a securities license lapse 3 years earlier and never renewed it, meaning every dollar he'd steered from Diane's accounts into his so-called investment vehicles had been funneled through something closer to an unregistered shell than any legitimate fund. Money that should have been growing for Diane's future had instead been quietly moved into accounts that traced, eventually, back toward Preston himself. They found a second life insurance policy Diane hadn't even discovered on her own, a smaller one taken out on me, naming Diane as the beneficiary, sure, on paper, but structured in a way our lawyer said was unusual, tied to a joint account that Preston could access without a second signature. When Renata explained what that meant, I had to leave the room for a few minutes. I needed air. They found messages going back over a year, not months, a full year of Preston discussing, in increasingly casual language, what their life would look like once things were finalized. Never explicit enough to be a confession on its own. Cowards like that rarely are. But taken together, pattern after pattern, message after message, document after document, it painted the picture of a man who had married my daughter, and somewhere along the way, started treating her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Every piece of evidence we uncovered went into a case file that grew thicker by the week. And every single day during those months, Diane went home to that house and smiled at that man across the dinner table and asked him about his day, because the plan required patience, and patience was the one thing Preston had never expected from either of us. Before I get to that final part, I want to tell you about the week leading up to Diane's disappearance, because those were some of the hardest days of my life, and I think you should know what they cost us both. Diane spent that week saying quiet, private goodbyes to a version of her old life, without ever letting on that's what she was doing. She went to lunch with the 2 friends who'd noticed her pulling away, and she told them, vaguely, that she was taking some time to reset, and she hugged them both a little longer than usual at the end of it. She walked through her old landscaping crew's job site one last time, the crew she'd sold off with the business, but still checked in on out of habit, and she thanked every single one of them by name for work they'd done together over the years. She didn't tell any of them why it felt like a goodbye. She just let it feel like one, because in a way, it was the last chapter of a life Preston had slowly been rewriting was about to close, whether he understood that or not. The night before she went off the grid, she sat with me at the kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning, going over every piece of the plan one more time, making sure there wasn't a single gap Preston could slip through. Renata had drilled into both of us how important it was that nothing leak. That not even well-meaning relatives be told the truth ahead of time, because grief, even fake grief, spreads through a family fast, and one slipped word to the wrong person could unravel months of careful work in a single afternoon. So Diane made peace with the fact that for 2 weeks, some people who loved her, people who had no idea what was actually happening, would believe, or nearly believe, that something terrible had occurred. That weighed on her. She told me that more than anything else in this whole ordeal, that was the part that kept her up at night. Not what Preston might do, what the people who loved her honestly might feel, even briefly, even by mistake. That's when the second part of the plan began, the part that led directly to that Sunday morning phone call. Diane and Renata worked with a small, discreet circle, a family friend willing to let Diane stay off the grid entirely, a doctor who was a longtime patient of mine and understood exactly what discretion meant, and law enforcement contacts Renata had cultivated over years of handling cases just like this one. Together, they built a scenario. Diane would disappear completely, no calls, no texts, no social media, nothing that could be traced. She would tell Preston she was going on a wellness retreat for 2 weeks, something he barely questioned, since by that point he was clearly counting down towards something of his own. What Preston didn't know was that during those 2 weeks, Diane was staying in the guest room of my house, 20 minutes from where he sat every night believing his wife was hundreds of miles away, disconnected from the world. What he didn't know was that every move he made during that window, every phone call, every visit to that notary's office, every conversation with his unlicensed investment advisor friend, was being quietly documented by people Diane and Renata had put in place. And then came the moment none of us fully anticipated, even with all our planning. Preston, apparently unable to wait any longer, apparently confident that 2 weeks of silence from his wife was as good as the real thing, decided to accelerate his own timeline. He filed paperwork with his insurance provider. He began quietly reaching out to a probate attorney of his own. And in a moment of arrogance, I still find it almost impossible to believe, even now, even knowing everything I know about that man, he decided the easiest, fastest way to speed along his own plan was to simply announce to the family that Diane had died. He never expected anyone to check. He never expected me to still be close enough to my daughter that she would be sitting in my kitchen at 6:30 in the morning when his call came through. That is the mistake greed always makes. If you give it enough time, it gets impatient, it gets careless, it starts believing its own story before the story is finished. So now you understand why he sounded so confident on that phone call, why his voice had no hesitation in it, why he laughed. In his mind, the hardest part was already behind him. He believed he had already won. He believed there was no one left who could stop him, because the one person capable of ruining everything, his own wife, was, according to the story he had built entirely in his own head, gone. He had no idea she was sitting 3 feet behind me, in her mother's old flannel robe, sipping coffee, waiting. Renata had prepared for this exact moment for weeks. The moment Preston made his move, whatever form it took, we would move too. And he made his move faster than any of us expected, which told us everything about how thin his patience for waiting had actually become. There was already a family gathering scheduled for that Sunday afternoon, what Preston had framed to his side of the family as a memorial gathering for Diane, hastily assembled, held at his parents' house across town, with a handful of relatives, a couple of Preston's colleagues from his firm, and this detail still makes my jaw tighten every time I think about it. A probate attorney he'd invited under the pretense of helping the family understand next steps, a man who, unbeknownst to Preston, was about to watch his client's entire scheme collapse in real time. Renata told us, let him have his gathering, let him stand up in front of everyone and make his case. Let him say out loud, in a room full of witnesses, exactly what he believed he was entitled to. And then, once he had committed himself fully, publicly, on record, that's when Diane would walk through the door. I asked Diane, once quietly the night before, whether she was ready for it. Whether facing him in front of all those people, after everything he'd done, was something she could carry. She looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when she'd already made up her mind about something important. "Dad," she said, "I've been carrying it for a year already. I just get to finally put it down." Sunday afternoon, I drove separately to Preston's parents' house, arriving a little after the gathering had already begun, the way Renata had instructed. I want to tell you what that room looked like when I walked in, because I need you to understand exactly what kind of man we were dealing with. There were flowers. Preston had ordered flowers, white lilies arranged around a photograph of Diane that I recognized from her business website, blown up and printed on foam board like some kind of makeshift memorial display. There was quiet, somber music playing from a speaker somewhere in the corner. People were dressed in dark colors, dabbing at their eyes, hugging each other in the doorway. Preston's mother had actually been crying, real tears. I could see that much, and it turned my stomach to realize she had no idea her own son had orchestrated this entire performance around a lie. And there at the front of the room stood Preston himself, dressed in a black suit, looking every bit the grieving widower, shaking hands, accepting condolences, nodding solemnly at each one like he'd rehearsed the expression in a mirror, which, knowing what I know now, he probably had. The probate attorney sat near the front with a leather folder on his lap. I watched Preston lean down and murmur something to him, and the attorney nodded, opened the folder, glanced at a document inside. Then Preston stood, cleared his throat, and addressed the room. He talked about Diane like she was already a memory instead of a living woman staying 20 minutes from where he stood. He talked about her brilliant business mind and her generous heart, using phrases so hollow I nearly laughed out loud right there in the middle of his performance. And then, without much of a transition at all, he shifted from grief to business, the mask slipping just enough for anyone paying close attention to see what was underneath it. He said that as her husband, and per the will they had updated together, a will I would later learn Diane had never actually reviewed in its final altered form, a will that had been quietly modified through that same corrupted notary, everything belonged to him now. The house, the remaining business assets, the accounts, all of it. He said it with a straight face, in front of his grieving mother, in front of Diane's family friends who had shown up out of respect for a woman he claimed was gone. And then, because a man like that cannot help himself once he believes he's already won, he looked directly at me, the only person in that room who had not shed a single tear that day, and he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "I know this is hard for you, Edward. Losing a daughter and losing everything she built all at once. But I promise you, I'll honor her memory the right way." I felt every eye in that room turn toward me. I said nothing, because that was the exact moment the front door opened. I don't think I will ever, for as long as I live, forget the sound that room made. It wasn't a gasp, not exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the sound of 30 people's breath catching in their chests all at once, followed by a silence so complete you could hear the flowers settling in their vases. Diane stood in the doorway, not in mourning clothes, not pale, not weak, not anything close to what a room full of people expecting a memorial had steeled themselves to feel sorrow over. She stood there in a simple gray dress, her chin level, her eyes fixed directly on her husband, alive in every sense of the word, and angrier than I had ever seen another human being in my entire life, though you'd have had to know her as long as I did to see it, because on the surface, she looked almost peaceful. Preston's face did something I have thought about many times since. It didn't go through shock the way you'd expect. It went through calculation first. I watched his eyes flick toward the exits, toward the attorney, toward his mother, like a man running numbers, trying to figure out if there was any version of this moment he could still talk his way out of. Then, and only then, did the color drain out of his face. "Diane," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with panic. Diane didn't answer him, not yet. She walked slow and deliberate across that room full of stunned relatives and confused colleagues, past the foam board photograph of herself surrounded by lilies, until she was standing directly in front of him. And that is when she said the words I promised you at the beginning of this story. The exact words she said to him on the phone that morning, and the words she repeated to his face, in front of everyone, that Sunday afternoon. She said, "You told my father I was dead and that he lost everything. You're wrong on both counts. I'm very much alive. And in about 10 minutes, you're going to understand exactly what you lost. I want to describe that room to you one more time because I don't think I'll ever see anything quite like it again as long as I live." Preston's mother had risen halfway out of her chair, one hand still pressed against her chest, staring at Diane like she was looking at a ghost that had wandered in from the wrong kind of story. A cousin near the back dropped a paper cup of punch, and the sound of it hitting the floor seemed impossibly loud in that silence, and nobody so much as glanced toward it. The music Preston had chosen for his fake memorial kept playing softly in the corner, some slow instrumental piece, completely indifferent to the fact that the woman it had been selected to mourn was standing very much alive in the middle of the room, and for one strange, suspended moment, that mismatch, grieving music underscoring a resurrection nobody had prepared for was almost more unsettling than anything Preston himself said or did. The room stayed dead silent. Preston opened his mouth and nothing came out. Diane turned to the probate attorney, who by then had gone pale himself, folder still open on his lap. "You might want to close that," she said, "because everything in it is built on forged documents and I have the proof sitting in my car." What happened over the next 20 minutes was, without exaggeration, one of the most satisfying things I have ever witnessed in 71 years of living. Renata walked in behind Diane, along with two other people I recognized, the forensic accountant who had spent months tracing every dollar and a detective from the county fraud division who had been quietly briefed on the case for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. Renata didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply laid out, piece by piece, in front of Preston's stunned family, everything that had been uncovered. The forged deed transfer, with the actual notary's admission already on record after being confronted the week before. The insurance policy taken out without Diane's knowledge or consent, naming Preston as sole beneficiary, filed suspiciously close to the timeline of his so-called grieving performance. The unlicensed investment advisor and the shell accounts that traced dollar for dollar back to funds diverted from Diane's business sale. The messages, read aloud verbatim, in that quiet, steady courtroom voice lawyers develop over years, messages where Preston and his associate joked in writing about how trusting Diane was and how everything would be in place soon. I watched Preston's mother sink into a chair, both hands pressed over her mouth. I watched his colleagues from the firm exchange looks and quietly slip toward the door, already understanding what this meant for whatever professional reputation Preston had left. I watched the probate attorney close that leather folder for good and start gathering his things, clearly recognizing he wanted no further part of whatever was about to happen to his now former client. And I watched Preston himself, the man who had laughed at me over the phone that morning, the man who told me I had lost everything, shrink into something smaller than I ever thought possible. Gone was the polished confidence, the easy charm, the man who remembered everyone's birthday. What was left standing in that room was a man cornered by his own greed, stammering half-sentences that fell apart before he could finish them, looking for an exit that no longer existed. He tried, at one point, to turn to his own mother, as if she might somehow shield him from what was unfolding. "Mom, this isn't, they're twisting this, I can explain," he started, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. I've never in my life seen a mother look at her son the way Preston's mother looked at him in that moment. It wasn't hatred. It was something worse, something closer to grief for the version of him she thought she'd raised, a version that apparently had never fully existed outside of her own hope. She sat back down slowly, and she didn't say a single word to him for the rest of that afternoon. He tried the lawyer next, grabbing at the sleeve of the probate attorney's jacket as the man tried to leave. "You have to help me sort this out," Preston said, his voice climbing towards something desperate now, all pretense of composure gone. The attorney simply pulled his arm back, straightened his jacket, and told him quietly but firmly that he would no longer be representing him in any capacity, effective immediately. That was the moment, I think, that it truly landed for Preston, not the detective, not Renata's calm recitation of evidence, not even Diane standing there very much alive. It was watching the last person in that room who was professionally obligated to be on his side walk out the door without looking back. The detective stepped forward and asked Preston to step outside with him to answer a few questions. Preston looked at Diane one last time, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw something like an apology trying to form on his face. It never made it out of his mouth. Some men don't have that in them, even when they're staring straight at the wreckage they made with their own 2 hands. Diane didn't watch him walk out. She turned instead, found me standing near the back of that room, and crossed the space between us the way she used to when she was small enough to run into my arms after school. I held my daughter in the middle of that ruined memorial, surrounded by lilies meant to mourn a woman who was standing right there, breathing, alive, furious, and free. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," she whispered against my shoulder. "I needed him to believe it completely. I needed there to be no way for him to talk his way out." I told her she never had anything to apologize for, not one single thing. She had done something braver than most people manage in an entire lifetime. She had swallowed her own fear and her own fury for months, quietly, patiently, so that when the truth finally came out, it couldn't be argued with, couldn't be softened, couldn't be spun by a man who had built his entire life on spinning things. Later that evening, back at my kitchen table, the same chairs, the same coffee mugs we'd used 100 Sunday mornings before that phone call ever came, Diane told me the rest of it. How she'd known, deep down, for weeks before she found that folder, that something was wrong, but hadn't let herself believe it because believing it meant accepting that the man she married had never really loved her at all, only what she had built. How the hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence or staging the reveal. The hardest part was sitting across from him at dinner every night during those final months, smiling, asking about his day, pretending she didn't know what he was. "Did you do that?" I asked her. "How did you sit there and pretend?" She was quiet for a moment, turning her mug slowly in her hands, the same way her mother used to when she was choosing her words carefully. "There were nights I almost couldn't do it," she admitted. "There was one night, maybe 2 months in, where he made a joke at dinner, something small, something about how lucky he was that I trusted him with everything, and I had to excuse myself to the bathroom because I thought I was going to be sick. I sat on that same bathroom floor again and asked myself if I was strong enough to keep going, or if I should just confront him right then and let the pieces fall wherever they landed." I asked her what changed her mind. "You did," she said. "Not anything you said, just I thought about what it would do to you, hearing it secondhand, watching me get torn apart in a messy fight with no proof behind me, watching him twist it into me being the unstable one. I decided I'd rather hand you the truth already proven than hand you a mess, and ask you to believe me on faith alone. You'd already believed in me my whole life. I didn't want this to be the one time you had to take it on faith." That's when I had to look away from her for a moment, because 71 years old or not, there are things a father hears from his daughter that get past every defense he's built up over a lifetime. Because I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let him take my whole life the way he tried to take everything else, she finally said. He could have my patience for a few months. He was never getting the rest of me. Consequences came fast after that, once the wheels of the investigation were fully in motion. Preston was charged with forgery, attempted fraud, and identity theft related to the deed transfer and the insurance policy filed without Diane's consent. His unlicensed investment advisor friend was charged separately, facing his own set of fraud counts once investigators traced the full scope of the diverted funds. The notary who had forged signatures for a fee lost his license entirely and is, as of this telling, facing charges of his own tied to more than one victim, not just Diane. I sat in the courtroom for the arraignment, watching Preston in a rumpled version of the same kind of suit he'd worn to that fake memorial, no longer polished, no longer confident, no longer able to talk his way around a room full of people who wanted something from him other than his charm. His parents sat 2 rows behind him, his mother's face still carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent months trying to reconcile the son she raised with the man the evidence described. I didn't feel joy watching that. I want to be honest about that. I felt something closer to relief mixed with a strange, quiet sadness, the sadness of watching a family that wasn't mine come apart at the seams because of choices only one of them had made. Preston's firm terminated him within a week. Once word of the arrest reached his employer, turns out a man doesn't get to keep his job in finance once he's been publicly charged with financial fraud against his own wife. The divorce proceedings that followed were about as fast and as one-sided as any I've ever heard of, helped considerably by the mountain of evidence Diane and Renata had spent months assembling. Preston walked away from that marriage with nothing but the suit on his back and a legal record that will follow him for the rest of his life. Diane pursued restitution through the civil courts for every dollar that had been diverted through those shell accounts. And while I won't pretend the process was quick or painless, these things rarely are, she recovered the bulk of what had been taken, along with damages that, frankly, felt like the closest thing to justice a courtroom can actually provide. I heard secondhand, through someone who still runs in Preston's old circles, that he moved out of state a few months later, started over somewhere nobody knew his name yet. I don't know if that's true, and I'll be honest with you, I stopped caring to find out. Some men aren't worth the energy it takes to keep tracking their fall. Better to spend that energy on the people still standing. As for Diane and me, we've spent the months since rebuilding something I didn't realize we'd lost until we got it back. She sold the house she'd shared with Preston, didn't want a single wall of that place, didn't want the memory of pretending to smile across a dinner table night after night. She used part of the restitution money to start a new venture, something entirely her own this time, no outside investors, no advisors who weren't licensed, no husband handling the boring paperwork on her behalf. Just her and a small team she trusts completely, and a business plan she keeps locked up tighter than any filing cabinet ever was. She comes by every Sunday morning now, same as she used to before any of this happened, except something's different in the way she sits at that table. She's not careful with her sentences anymore. She finishes her own thoughts. She laughs the way she used to laugh before a man convinced her, slowly and quietly, that trust was something to be managed rather than something to be given freely. We've started rebuilding some of the old traditions too, the ones that quietly disappeared during those months when Preston kept finding reasons to reroute our lives around his own convenience. Thanksgiving is back at Diane's place this year, her new place, a smaller house on the other side of town with a kitchen she designed herself, down to the exact placement of every cabinet. She hosted it like she used to, apron on, radio playing something with too much brass in it, waving off help from anyone who offered, because she says cooking for people she loves is the one kind of control she actually wants in her life. I sat at that table in November and watched her laugh at something one of her old friends said, one of the same friends who'd noticed, all those months ago, that something in Diane had gone quiet, and I thought about how far back that laugh had traveled to get to that room. Her business is doing well. Better than well, if I'm honest, though she'd never say so herself, because she was raised not to brag, same as I was raised not to. She's careful now in a different way than she was careful under Preston's influence, not fearful careful, but wise careful. Every contract gets read twice. Every advisor gets vetted independently before she lets them near a single account. She jokes sometimes that Preston taught her more about protecting herself than any business school ever could have, and I always tell her that's not a debt she owes him, that's a strength she built out of the wreckage he left behind, and there's a difference between the two, even if the end result looks the same from a distance. I sit across from her most Sundays now, watching her stir cream into her coffee, and I think about how close we came to losing everything to a man who never deserved a single ounce of what he was handed. I think about the phone call, I think about the laugh in his voice, and I think about how wrong he was, in the end, about absolutely everything he believed he understood about my daughter. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. Greed doesn't just destroy the people it's aimed at, it destroys the man carrying it long before he ever realizes what he's lost. Preston spent a year convinced he had outsmarted everyone around him, his wife, his father-in-law, an entire family who trusted him without question. He was so certain he had already won that he made the fatal mistake every greedy man eventually makes. He got impatient. He got careless. And the truth, which had been quietly gathering itself in the shadows the entire time, walked through the front door exactly when he least expected it, in a gray dress, with her chin up, and no mercy left to give him. I used to believe that the worst thing a person could do to family was lie to their face. I don't believe that anymore. I believe the worst thing a person can do is convince themselves they've already gotten away with it, before the truth has even finished catching up to them. Preston didn't just lie to us. He built an entire architecture of lies, room by room, over the course of a year, and he moved into that architecture so completely that by the end, I don't think he could tell the difference anymore between the story he was telling everyone else and the story he was telling himself. That's the real danger of greed, in my experience. It doesn't just corrupt what a person does. Eventually, it corrupts what they believe is true. I think about all the small warning signs now, the shortened phone calls, the rerouted holidays, the careful, rehearsed way Diane started speaking whenever his name came up in conversation. And I wonder how many other families out there are living through the early chapters of the exact same story right now, without the benefit of hindsight I have today. If there's anything practical I can offer you, beyond just the story itself, it's this: trust your instincts when something in a relationship starts to feel managed instead of natural. Trust the quiet, uneasy feeling when someone you love starts sounding less and less like themselves. It very rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps in slowly, one reasonable-sounding excuse at a time, and by the time it's loud enough to notice without question, a great deal of damage may already be done. He thought he'd won at 6:30 in the morning. By Sunday afternoon, he understood exactly how wrong he was. Before you go, I want to ask you a few things, because I'd genuinely like to know what you think. What would you have done if that phone call had come to you at 6:30 in the morning? Would you have believed him, even for a second, the way I did? Do you think Preston ever really believed he'd committed the perfect crime? Or was his own greed always going to expose him eventually? No matter how careful he thought he was being, if you were in Diane's position, would you have revealed yourself right away, the moment you found that folder, or would you have waited, the way she did, and built your case in silence until the moment was exactly right? Have you ever watched someone in your own life let greed tear their family apart, right in front of everyone, and refuse to see it happening until it was too late? And the question I still find myself sitting with some nights. More than any of the others, do you think a man like that ever deserves forgiveness after everything he tried to take? Or is there a line once crossed that simply can't be walked back? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one, and I answer as many as I can, because stories like this one only mean something if we keep talking to each other about them honestly. Thank you for sitting with this story from beginning to end. It cost my family a great deal to live through it. Months of quiet fear, a daughter forced to smile across a dinner table at a man she no longer recognized, a father who had to sit with the worst 3 seconds of his life before understanding they weren't real. I only hope that telling it costs a little less, and maybe helps somebody out there recognize the same quiet warning signs before it's too late for them too. If even one person watching this decides to trust that uneasy feeling in their gut a little sooner than I did, then every uncomfortable minute of telling this story out loud will have been worth it. Until next time, take care of the people who trust you, and never let anyone convince you that silence in the face of a lie is the same thing as peace.